Hello, my name is Hunter Proven, and I've been asked to present what we know about the male uniparental line ancestors of the J2b Wordens. Our uniparental line ancestors are our fathers, 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 etc. This presentation will begin with our more distant ancestors, uh, ancestors who we share with tens of millions of men living around the world. And it will move forward in time until the point before when the Warden clan is known from genealogical records. While the J2b, most recent common ancestor, lived 15,700 years ago, I will begin this presentation in the Neolithic, about 10,000 years ago, because this is the age of the oldest ancient J2b samples found to date. First, I'm going to talk about our J2b ancestors from the Neolithic. Then, I will talk about interesting things about our distant cousins. Then I will talk about our J2b-L283 ancestors. That's our specific branch of J2b. Their Copper Age migration from the Near East to the Balkans. And then I will wrap it up with the Warden ancestors' migration from the Balkans to England. The oldest ancient J2b samples have been found in an arc from the Caucasus to West Iran. Going clockwise from the northwest in the Caucasus, we have a sample from Imereti, Georgia, that is dating to 7,700 BC. Then we have a sample from a site called Mentesh Tepe. Oh, so that man was a hunter-gatherer, because this was about 10,000 years ago. Next sample going counterclockwise is western part of Azerbaijan. It's an ancient, near the border of Georgia. The ancient site is called Mentesh Tepe. This sample dates to 5,700 BCE. The name of the culture was the Shulaveri Shomu culture. I'm not going to describe these different cultures because the video would become really long, but you can read about what is known by Googling these names of these sites. I'll have some links in the attached article. Next, going counterclockwise, near Lake Urmia, just south of Lake Urmia in modern Iran, we have a 4,900 BCE sample found in the site called Haji Firuz Tepe. And then the oldest sample is a bit further south in the western Zagros Mountains. The site is called Tepe Abdul Hossein, and this sample dates to about 8,000 BCE. The sample from Tepe Abdul Hossein was part of an early Neolithic culture, and they practiced animal husbandry, at least with goats. So they had domesticated goats. One interesting note that I will add right now is that we know that that the genetic stock of the first farmers of Europe descends from the first farmers of Anatolia. And one interesting thing that was either from the study of this Tepe Abdul Hossein sample, or maybe it was a different study, I don't recall right now. But one of the conclusions from that study was that the first farmers from the Zagros Mountains were genetically distinct from the first farmers of Anatolia that went on, some of whom went on to introduce agriculture in Europe. So what it means is these farmers from the Zagros Mountains mostly just have the same DNA as the hunter-gatherers of the same area. In other words, this innovation of animal husbandry and other aspects of Neolithic culture were developed in sight, and not as a result of a mass migration of other people from somewhere else bringing this technology. So anyone who is J2b, the Wardens, and others who are male line J2b, uh, uh, we know that our ancestors, our male line ancestors, were among the first farmers in the world, and there's no evidence that somebody else taught them how to do these farming techniques. They may have innovated innovated that on their own. Uh, they were not all farmers, because by the time these innovations by the time these innovations started, this sample that was 10,000 years old, uh, by that time J2b was already 5,000 years old itself. I mean, the male line J2b, all the men that descend from the one J2b ancestor who lived 15,000 years ago. By 10,000 years ago, there were many men living in different areas, like on the map that I shared. Not all of them were farmers by 10,000 years ago. Like, for example, the one man that was in the cave in Georgia, he was a hunter-gatherer. So not all of our ancestors were farmers. But maybe that sample from the cave in Georgia should have been a farmer, because his line died out. He's not closely related to any living men. He's more than 10,000 years distantly related to any living men. There are hardly anyone in Georgia living today is J2b male line, and those who uh, appear to be more recent migrants from further south. So J2b looks like it died out in Georgia. It had died out in the past, got repopulated. But why didn't he become a farmer? It just has to do with the climate. I'm not an expert in this, so I won't talk to it. So while J2b died out in the Caucasus, in South Caucasus, in Azerbaijan and Iran, there are some living men who are still who are J2b. Um, in, in each case, it's not clear if their ancestor, if they reflect a continuity, meaning a geographic continuity of their male line, meaning their male line has been in Azerbaijan or Iran, what are now Azerbaijan and Iran, for thousands and thousands of years, or not. It's not yet clear, but they could be. But regardless, what is true is J2b does not constitute the majority of living men from these regions anymore. Other groups came in later and did better, and the older lines that J2b had established in these regions um, either died out or moved away to some extent. Okay, next section. Interesting things about our distant J2b cousins. There are several major lines of J2b, each about 10 to 16,000 years distantly related from one another, and each with very different geographic distributions. If you're looking on social media or on the web, a lot of people have opinions about J2b this, J2b that. Everyone who's from Europe who's J2b got there by this and this and that. Anybody who's speaking in this kind of a language is generalizing way too much, because if you're talking about a migration from 5,000 years ago, you should talk about that specific line of J2b that you're referring to, because the J2b is all over the place by 5,000 years ago. By 5,000 years ago, one line of J2b has already migrated to Europe. By 5,000 years ago, another line of J2b has been in India for thousands of years already. Okay, interesting cousins. First ones I'm going to talk about are South Asian agriculturists, J2b-Z2433. That's just the name of their mutation. One of the J2b lines, though not the Wordens, migrated to South Asia about 7,700 years ago, and likely was carried by those who first brought agriculture to that region. Some have speculated that they may have introduced the Dravidian language family into India. I don't have an opinion on that because I'm not a comparative linguist. This theory, in order to be strong, would have to show why it would be unlikely that Proto-Dravidian was not already being spoken in South Asia by the hunter-gatherers that were previously living there. Interesting cousins, number 2, possibly ancient Mesopotamians. One line called J2b-M205 appears to have massively diversified about 5,800 years ago, somewhere in or near ancient Mesopotamia, and now comprises around 80% of the male population of the island of Socotra, while it is much rarer everywhere else. Therefore, Socotra, which is off the coast of Yemen, can veritably be called a J2b island. Our J2b cousins from Socotra's ancestors all descended from one man who lived about 3,000 years ago. Since his closest relatives are from Oman or Yemen, it makes sense that the migration to Socotra was relatively local. I think that this migration of this line of J2b to Socotra and to Yemen and Oman was done by sea, by way of sea trade, links from Sumeria, because Sumeria was on the coast. At that time, Sumeria had a coastline. Now it's more inland of the Persian Gulf. I made a video about my theories for J2b M205 being possibly ancient Mesopotamians. Specifically, I think Sumerians. At the time of this recording, I believe that we are still waiting on any kind of male ancient sample dating to the time of the ancient Mesopotamians to be found and or genetically sequenced to know the male haplogroup. I don't think we have any data like this yet. So this is my theory, and we will see if it ever is corroborated by ancient DNA. Okay, next section is J2b-L283. That's our line of J2b, by the way. It's about a 5,000-year-old line. Migration to Europe in the Copper Age. The most interesting thing about us is that the migration of our ancestors to Europe, and even where they started from during the Copper Age, is not well evidenced by ancient DNA. One promising theory, backed by some circumstantial evidence, is that our ancestors had been living in the steppes north of the Caucasus prior to migrating to the Balkans. There is a large and growing body of research, including archaeology and ancient autosomal and Y-DNA, showing that nomadic pastoralists from the Pontic-Caspian steppe migrated through Ukraine to Southeast Europe in several waves starting in the Copper Age. However, none of the ancient samples from these Copper Age cultures have been found to be J2b-L283. Actually, we're waiting for an ancient sample to be published, but there is a J2b-L283 from the Copper Age from Moldova, but none from the steppes. Okay. Because this presentation is high level, try to be inclusive to everyone who doesn't have the background on J2b. I'm not going to go into the details of why this theory versus other alternative migration theories of how J2b-L283 got to Europe. I won't go into the details of that. Also, it doesn't even make sense until this sample from Moldova is published, because this is oldest sample by far of our line in Europe, if it dates to Copper Age, as I believe that it's been rumored to. So that has to be published, and then we can look at the data. Now I'm going to talk about one of the major line of J2b-L283 that most living men descend from, that is a little bit younger. It established itself after the initial migration to Europe. One particular line did very well around on the western in the Western Balkans. And this line is known by the mutation Z2507. So most living J2b-L283 descend from this line, and it's strongly this lineage is strongly associated with the ancient culture known as the Cetina culture. It's named from a river, the Cetina River, which along which numerous sites of this culture have been found in the Dalmatia Split County of Croatia and in Herzegovina. Or I'm sorry, that's where the river goes. But this culture spanned the entire Adriatic coast of the Balkans and the Adriatic coast of Italy and parts of Sicily and Malta, the island of Pantelleria, and also parts of Greece. And so I will say now a common question is our lineage, were we ancient Greeks? This is a question that comes up sometimes. I think it came up more in the past because now people understand better. Well, we're not really found very much among living Greeks, and none of the ancient samples, none of the oldest ancient samples are from Greece. However, one ancient sample has been found from northern Greece. Well, no, not northern Greece, northern Peloponnesus. And this corresponds to part of where the Cetina culture expanded. So this sample, this ancient J2b-L283 sample that was found in Bronze Age Greece was in an area that later became dominated by the Mycenaeans. But originally, this sample's ancestors probably came from the Cetina expansion that traces to the Western Balkans. So, short answer to the question, is our line related to ancient Greeks? Well, small number of men that are related to us, our cousins, a small number of them ended up migrating to Greece. But that's not the homeland of most of our lines. It's the homeland of most of our living lines is the Western Balkans. The next section I'm going to talk about, we're moving forward in time to the Iron Age. The title of this section is J2b-Z631. Prolific Iron Age dynasty of uncertain geographic origin. So the Wordens are in this particular line of J2b-L283. Starting around 900 BCE, one line of the already prolific along the Adriatic J2b-Z2507 that I was just talking about, that was associated with the Cetina culture, which spread all over the Adriatic. One line of this already prolific line started to sire dozens and dozens of child, grandchild, and great-grandchild, etc. lines that survive to this day. That was around 900 BCE. Their measured rate of diversification during this period vastly outstripped any of their cousins. The most prolific line comprises of at least 8 generations of men, which all had at least 2 surviving child lines, and who approximately lived between 900 and 500 BCE. So this is just from the genetics. This is from the mutations called SNPs. I'm not going to go into the technical details of it, but these are date estimates. These dates are estimated by number of mutations, and we don't know exactly how many generations happen um, before one of these mutations happen. So these are just estimates. But there are 8 different branching points, successive generations where most of these lines are defined by just a single mutation. So that's why I say that this was a relatively rapid diversification. What was the reason for their success? Since we don't exactly know where this lineage originated, we have a hard time answering this question for sure. That's because we don't have an ancient sample that's dating to right when this lineage formed. Uh, so we don't know exactly where it originated. Could this man have been living somewhere different from the rest of his J2b Z2507 cousins, which, for reasons of climate, natural resources, or trade, had better conditions for survival and growth? Or could the reason be more a result of the political dominance of one man's clan over a relatively larger group of other tribes than was commonplace at the time? The survival rate of each line is another factor that is also involved. Think of Plato's allegory of the cave. Until all ancient human beings are found and sequenced, which will never happen, we can only measure a fraction of the true diversification of a line by the number of men who survive to this day, living men, uh, and among those men who survive, those who decide to test their Y DNA. The survival rate of 2 neighboring tribes, which may have been closely related on the male line, could be vastly different due to geopolitics, let alone natural disasters, plagues, or famines, which may more adversely impact some areas than others. One promising candidate for the homeland of J2b-Z631 is the Glasinac-Mati culture, which encompassed much of modern Albania to the south, and Kosovo to the east, Montenegro, southeastern Bosnia and Herzegovina, and parts of western Serbia to the north. Perhaps the J2b-Z631, most recent common ancestor, who lived around 900 BCE, perhaps he was the common ancestor of a group of men from a clan that was later successful in establishing hegemony over much of the Glasinac-Mati cultural horizon. This area was inhabited by different tribal confederations by the time of recorded history, but each of these tribes may have been rich in J2b-Z631. The Dardanians, centered around modern Kosovo, were one of the main Illyrian tribes known by the Greeks. The Dardanians were conquered by the Romans and incorporated into the province of Moesia, and later their homeland may have been spared from the ravages of the War of the Batos, though they no doubt took part in it on the side of the Romans, as 3 legions from Moesia were sent to subdue the massive and initially successful uprising of Illyrian tribes. That's the War of the Batos. I will talk about this in the next section. The next section is about the Bellum Batonorum, War of the Batos. This was a large-scale conflict that lasted 3 years between Illyrian and Pannonian. These are kind of geographic terms. They may have these cultures, these tribes may have all spoken similar languages. I don't think anyone really knows. But they were tribes from the region called Pannonia, which is southern part of Hungary, and Illyria, Illyrian tribes around the Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, some parts of western Serbia. These tribes revolted. The scale of this tragic war that likely pitted many of our J2b-L283 male line ancestors' cousins against each other is too great to leave unmentioned in a history of the Wordens' male line ancestors. Given the distribution of our haplogroup throughout the Western Balkans and Italy, and the scale of the conflict, it is almost without doubt that some of our male line ancestors' cousins involved in this conflict were fighting for their independence. Some were fighting as Roman auxiliaries, and some were fighting as Roman citizens from Italy. The War of the Batos is so named because the two main commanders of the rebel coalition were both men named Bato. Bato the Deicitiate, it's an Illyrian tribe, and Bato the Breucian. There is a good chance that one or even both of these men may have been related to us on the male line, given that J2b-L283 appears to have been the most prevalent haplogroup in the Western Balkans during the late Bronze Age and Iron Age. I read the book The Great Illyrian Revolt by Jason R. Abdale. Some may find the tongue-in-cheek style of the author's narrative or the great amount of speculation to be a distraction, but this is the only book I could find on Amazon on the topic. So if you want to learn more about it, you might be interested to read that book. In 6 CE, the Romans called up some Illyrian tribes to report for military service as auxiliaries in a campaign against the Marcomanni. That's a tribe that was living in what's now Czechia, I believe. However, when these troops gathered, they, upon seeing how strong they were, decided instead to attack the Romans under the leadership of Bato the Deicitiate, a tribe from central Bosnia. Or maybe it was actually planned in advance. Regardless, after this initial success, other Illyrian tribes joined the rebellion. Suetonius gave a description of the war. The most serious of all foreign wars since those with Carthage, which Tiberius carried on for 3 years with 15 legions and a corresponding force of auxiliaries, amid great difficulties of every kind and the utmost scarcity of supplies. His claim of 15 legions is debunked by other historians. Here I give the Wikipedia summary. On 3 occasions, the 3 legions from the Roman province of Moesia were involved in the fighting, and on 1 occasion, 2 legions from the Roman province of Asia were also involved. Through most of the war, it was the 5 legions stationed in Illyricum, 2 in Pannonia and 2 in Dalmatia, which were engaged in this war, which covered a very large area. In addition, there were irregular emergency units levied in Italy. The rebels had an efficient military organization which paralleled that of the Romans, given that they had previously served in Roman-trained auxiliary military units. However, they did not have a regular army and relied largely upon guerrilla tactics, avoiding pitched battles. There were only 3 major battles in the area of Sirmium, that's Sremska Mitrovica in modern Serbia, in nearby northern Moesia, and a number of minor battles in Dalmatia. Much of the Roman war effort instead involved counterinsurgency operations. Think scorched earth and genocide. Many indigenous men died as a result of this conflict, or were otherwise forcibly relocated to other parts of the empire. If the theory that our particular line of J2b-L283 had been living in southeastern Illyria is true, then one possible factor contributing to our line today being more prolific than our northern Illyrian cousins could be due to their having sustained greater casualties in the War of the Batos. That is to say, our closer relatives may have been among the tribes inhabiting Moesia that did not join the rebellion. On the other hand, more of those men may have survived to sire sons who took part in later Roman campaigns, establishing themselves all over Roman-controlled Europe. Okay, the next section is J2b-Z631 in the Roman Empire. An ancient sample positive for our line of J2b-Z631 has been found in a military cemetery in Timacum Minus, today's Ravna, Serbia. Because other related lineages have been found in the Western Balkans since the Bronze Age, it makes the most sense to assume that these men's male line ancestors were indigenous Balkanites who had been recruited to serve in the Roman military rather than being Roman colonizers from Italy. We can look at the distribution of the name Bato to get an idea of the scope of the migration of Illyrians. According to Wikipedia, Bato is one of the most characteristically Illyrian names found throughout northern and southern Illyria. Outside Illyria, it is found among Roman Illyrian soldiers from the Balkans, in Europe, the Illyrian community in Alburnus Maior, which was Dacia, Roman province, roughly corresponding to Romania. It is also found in the Iapygian lands of southern Italy and the wider Hellenistic Mediterranean. The female version of the name Bato is Batea and appears twice in Greek mythology. To the extent that our deeper male line origin is from the Western Balkans, you can consider the spread of Illyrian names to Italy and other parts of Europe as part of the historic record of the migration of our lines. Our Y-DNA being from Northwest Europe, the Wordens and mine personally I'm talking about here, as well as many others of our distant cousins, is part of the genetic record. Our Y-DNA is part of the genetic record of a migration from the Balkans. These names in the historic record, like there's gravestones in England and other parts of the former Roman Empire where they have Illyrian names, even if we don't do the DNA test of these samples, we know that they're from Illyria. I suspect a lot of these samples, if they are tested, a lot of them will be J2b-Z631. There's an additional ancient sample positive for our line of J2b-Z631 found in the Via Salaria necropolis of Rome itself. This sample dates to about 150 CE and is definitely not from an earlier period of Roman history, based on when we know the necropolis to have been constructed from historic records. So this sample may have been a man who migrated to Rome after it had conquered his homeland in Illyria. I will also mention another branch, another line of J2b-L283 has been found in this part of Italy, predating the rise of the Roman Empire in an Etruscan context. But that's a different line. Our line has not been found in Italy prior to the rise of the Roman Empire. Now we're coming to the last section called Warden Ancestors Migration from Balkans to England. Since as of September 2023, the next closest Y-DNA relatives of the Warden clan are estimated to be about 2,800 years distantly related. We have no hard circumstantial evidence in the form of relatives, genetically proven relatives, from which to deduce a more likely migration path over time for the Warden male line ancestors migration that ultimately began somewhere in the Balkans in the Iron Age and ended in England. The lack of a closer male line relative is not uncommon in our European line of J2b, called J2b-L283. One approach we can take is to look at other lineages of J2b-Z631 that are now living in England. If we understand how most of the Warden's next closest relatives, even though they're 2,800 years distantly related, if we knew how most of these relatives, cousins, distant cousins, had migrated to England, then we could assume that that the way that the Wardens migrated, it would have been the same way. Unfortunately, we don't know how most of these lines of the Worden's closest cousins in J2b Z631, we just don't have enough circumstantial evidence to know for sure how they migrated to England at what time. The different vectors that we can consider for J2b-Z631 and the Worden's ancestor that could have brought them to England. The earliest, starting with the earliest in time, is Roman mediated. And this refers to anyone who migrated during the Roman period as a result of Roman policy, not limited to Italian Romans. So that includes Illyrian soldiers, for example, that were serving in the Roman army. Uh, uh, Also, what can be included, can be considered possible, is an Anglo-Saxon mediated migration to England, a Viking mediated migration, a Norman mediated migration, or later medieval migrations, or something that's not associated with a particular conquering people, but just through normal trade or political unions, somebody's marrying and moving from the continent to England. Haplogroups from Scandinavia, now living in England, might rightly suspect that their ancestors more likely migrated to England with the Anglo-Saxons, Normans, or Vikings than with the Romans, especially compared to if they were our haplogroup. So could someone of our haplogroup, J2b-Z631, actually descend from an Anglo-Saxon, Norman, or Viking? Yes, they could have. To give you an idea of just how mobile our J2b-Z631 ancestors were, a 1,000-year-old Viking burial on the island of Öland, Sweden, contained one male sample from J2b-Z631. His sample ID is VK346. You can see him on the Y-full Y tree. How could a Balkan haplogroup wind up as a Viking? This man's ancestors may have been soldiers in the Roman army stationed along the Lower Rhine, today's North Holland. The Romans even had a fortress as far north as Frisia, nowadays the city of Velsen, North Holland. 500 years is easily enough time to allow a male line to cross over into a neighboring culture, especially one that is proactively raiding. Back to a point that I made earlier, if we can infer how each of the other lineages of J2b-Z631 migrated to England, we could tally that up and then compute a probability distribution for how often each of the different vectors resulted in the migration to England. I mean, Roman versus Anglo-Saxon, Viking, Norman, or other. We could then assume that, absent other Y-DNA matches that might yield more insight into the route to England for the Worden's ancestors, that the probability of the various vectors having been behind the Worden migration to England is similar to the aforementioned computed probabilities. Unfortunately, there is a relative lack of interest to do DNA tests in the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. In France, DNA testing is even illegal. So the circumstantial evidence we would use to try to distinguish a line as having migrated with Normans, i.e. Frenchmen whose Y-DNA indicates he is between 1,000 and 1,500 years distantly related to some Englishmen, this circumstantial evidence is not going to exist in a database, even in cases where a line really did become established in England by way of William the Conqueror's invasion of England. Or it's not likely to exist in a database because French people are not doing as many tests. Regarding the possibility of Norman-mediated migration, my line is one of the only examples in J2b-Z631 with the right kind of circumstantial evidence. My ancestors tracing to Flanders are most closely related to men from England, who are all descended from one man who lived about 950 years ago. Their clans are Waring and Trussell, one or both of which appear to be of French descent. My line from Flanders may be a remnant, meaning my ancestors stayed on a continent, possibly near to where the common ancestor of my line and these Englishmen lived, about 1,700 years ago. However, and I'm not a Warden, I'm your distant relative from 2,800 years ago. But I'm one of your closest Y-DNA relatives, so my data is worth looking at. However, even in my relatively good circumstantial case, and also assuming that our most recent common ancestor, me and my English relatives, the Trussells and Warings, assuming that our most recent common ancestor was living on the continent 1,700 years ago, the migration of my English cousin's ancestor to England may actually have been anywhere between 1700 and 950 years ago. This is a fairly wide interval that could have been Roman, Anglo-Saxon, Viking, or Norman mediated. So, in other words, this the Englishmen's ancestor who migrated to England could have been during the Roman times, and they just didn't proliferate until the time of the Norman conquest, just coincidentally. But they weren't Normans. It's possible. The other point of uncertainty regarding my particular line is that we don't know for sure that our ancestor from 1,700 years ago was living on the continent when he sired the ancestors of what would be an English and a Flemish line. He could have actually been living in England, and in which case my ancestral line later migrated back to the continent, because I don't have any other Y-DNA relatives that are more closely related than these English people. We don't know when my line got established in Flanders. So I shared this example to give an idea of how hard it is to know for sure how an ancestral line of our relatively mobile lineage migrated to England. However, given that the Romans sent many thousands of men over hundreds of years to conquer and put down successive revolts in England, and given that there is ancient DNA evidence of Roman-mediated migration of men not indigenous to England, though not yet in our haplogroup, I assume that any J2b-Z631 in England, and actually any J2b-L283 for that matter, or actually any J2b, migrated there as a result of Roman mediation in the absence of other circumstantial data, such as French surnames, living in an area of heavy Viking settlement, or having Y-DNA matches within the last 1,500 years with men living somewhere nearby on the continent. So I consider the most likely explanation for how the Warden's ancestors migrated to England to have been Roman mediated. As far as subject matter experts on Warden genealogy concur that these conditions are not satisfied. And because according to my knowledge, Wardens have no Y-DNA matches within 2,800 years. Regarding Roman legions that went from the Western Balkans to Britannia, I found one so far from the book Legions of Rome by Stephen Dando Collins. To take part in Claudius's invasion of Britannia, the 9th Hispana marched from its base in Siscia, that's Sisak, Croatia, to the embarkation point of Bononia, Boulogne, France. The book cites only initially Spain regarding the recruitment area of this legion. There is, however, the possibility that while it was stationed in Croatia, that it recruited locals and J2b-Z631 may have been among them. After the successful invasion, the 9th Hispana was stationed at Lindum, modern Lincoln. In 60 CE, it suffered the loss of 4 cohorts during Boudicca's uprising. According to the Legions and Auxiliary Units in Moesia 2005 by Connor Whately, the Ala Scubulorum, a horse cavalry auxiliary unit, had been operating in Moesia or Macedonia at least during 1 to 4 CE, and was later transferred for the invasion of Britannia. Scubuli appear in the list of ethnic regimental names from the Wikipedia article, List of Roman Auxiliary Regiments. In that list, they are considered an Illyrian tribe that was originally based in what is now Skopje, North Macedonia. However, I will note that the German language Wikipedia cites that the original source, John Spall, questions whether or not the name derives from a tribe or a scubulus who may have been the name of the original commander. The German article of Wikipedia, German language version of the article of Wikipedia, also states that the Ala may in fact have originated in Hispania, but that this is unclear. Of these 2 units that took part in the invasion of Britannia, I consider Ala Scubulorum a more likely source for J2b-Z631 because the part of Western Balkans where it may have recruited is closer to what I consider the likely J2b-Z631 ancient homeland of the ancient Kingdom of Dardania, roughly modern Kosovo and neighboring regions. I'm not an expert on Roman history and only have access to a few books. There could very well be other Roman military units that recruited in the Western Balkans and were known to have served in Britannia. So consider Ala Scubulorum as just one example of 480 horsemen. I will conclude this presentation with an optimistic note. People from less sampled regions like France and the Low Countries, they are over time doing more of these Y-DNA tests, and ancient samples are continuing to be found and DNA tested, and we will learn more about how the Worden male line ancestor migrated to Britannia. We will learn more about it as we get more data points. I'm happy to re-examine this and further refine the theory regarding Wordens and all J2b L283 lineages that have migrated to Britannia. The truth is out there. We just have to test the right people.